Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Tonight's going to be awesome. We've got two fantastic women that are going to educate us on a subject that is vital to the interests of our country, which is democracy. Someone under challenge here at home. People are getting disillusioned with the system, and needed abroad for the sake of peace. Before I introduce Condi and Dana, I do want to thank Northern Trust, who has sponsored this event. I want to thank the supporters of the Bush Center, members of the Engage community, and Bush Cheney alumni. Laura and I had a chance to say hello to some of the folks that had worked with us in Washington, and it's a joy to see them. It's a joy not to be in Washington as well. The Bush Center is ably run by Ken Hirsch, and we want to thank you for your leadership, Ken, and his wife Julie is with him, and the executive director is Holly Kuzmich, and we thank you as well, Holly. Today, board members Pam Patsley and Karen Prothro are with us as well. Thank you all for being here. We have a program here called Pink Ribbon, Red Ribbon. It began because when we came back from Washington, we discovered that women who have the HIV virus on the continent of Africa are likely to get cervical cancer, and the leading cause of death for women on the continent of Africa is cervical cancer. So think about living in an African village and women are dying from AIDS, and the U.S. and others march in with one of the most compassionate healthcare programs ever, and women live, and then they die from a disease that's eminently curable. And so we had a board meeting today. Condi's the chair of it. Ambassador Debbie Burke's here, who works in the State Department, runs the PEPFAR program, which is the AIDS initiative, and is doing a hell of a job, as well as Charity Wallace, our board member. So we thank you all for being here. By the way, for those of you who support our program, here's what's happened. 370,000 women have been screened. The first step of dealing with cervical cancer is to convince women to be screened. That's a lot, and we can do a lot more and will. 119,000 girls have been vaccinated against HPV, which of course is the best way to deal with the issue. So we're making progress. I'm proud of what we've done here at the Institute, and you just need to know we're still focused on it. As America retreats, the Bush Center charges. And so one of the things I benefited from in my life is being surrounded by strong women. The first strong woman I was surrounded by, I had no choice. Mother. The second strong woman I was surrounded by, I had a choice, Laura. We have, so I'm often asked, as a leader, what do you like, how do you make decisions on who to surround yourself with? And the answer is, surround yourself with people who know what you don't know, and listen to them. I benefited a lot as president by having strong women tell me what I didn't know. I wisely listened. Two of them are here. My former press spokesman, now host, and by the way, that's a tough damn job, trying to interpret in English what I have spoken. And that was Dana's job. She is a host of the Daily Briefing, which comes on at 1 o'clock Central. I said to Dana, I never watch it, and Laura says, because you're always taking a nap at that time. She's also on the 5, and evidently that comes on at 5. And she's really good at what she does. And she'll be interviewing the author of Democracy Stories from the Long Road to Freedom. Condi is also a remarkable woman. Our friendship is forged in fire. I've seen her under enormous stress maintain her composure and her capacity to think through issues and think through problems. One of the great moments of the presidency came when she and Yo-Yo Ma performed a concert at Constitution Hall. She is remarkable, a great friend. Please welcome Dana and Condoleezza Rice.
Well, it's wonderful to be here in this room. In some ways, when I come here, even though I grew up in Wyoming and Colorado, I come to Texas and I feel like I came home. So, and certainly at the Bush Center, I feel that way. So all of you here, hello, and all of you in the overflow room, thanks for being here, and I will come see you in a moment. But first, we have Condoleezza Rice, who is really an inspiration, I think, to all of us. And I had someone today on social media after I interviewed her on my show say, Condoleezza Rice is a national treasure. So, thank you. Before I jump into questions, I do want to give you one anecdote. Recently, I was asked to do an interview with a reporter that used to cover the Bush administration, and she was writing about a book about women in Washington and how women could have the opportunity to move up in management or leadership in government faster than they could in corporate America. And I said, oh, well, that's actually an interesting topic. I'd be happy to talk to you. So her first question to me was, how hard was it to work in the Bush White House since it was such an old boys network? And I got my press secretary hat on and was kind of mad because I said, let me just give you an example of my day. If I had a question I needed to answer on foreign policy, I would call Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. On Homeland Security, I'd call Fran Townsend. If I needed something on legislative affairs, it was Candy Wolf. Counsel's office, I'd call Harriet Myers. If I needed somebody from education, Secretary Spellings, I could go on because there were so many women that were in the senior leadership, and President Bush doesn't get enough credit for that, so if we could give him a round of applause. All right, so I told Secretary Rice I was going to ask her a question that I think is a good conversation starter. I've used this at some dinner parties recently, and I think for her it's actually a really good one, which is, what is your first news memory, and did it influence your educational or career decisions?
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, it's really great to be here at the Bush Center. And President and Mrs. Bush, thank you for everything that you've done and continue to do. And Dana, thank you. And now, since we have known each other for so long, you're going to have to call me Condi.
It's hard for me to do it, but I'll try.
Yes. So my first memory was really of the race to put a man in space. And we would watch on television, and one thing that was happening then that we have kind of atomized news now, but everybody watched either the Huntley-Brinkley Report, which is what my parents and I watched, or Walter Cronkite. A few people watched Howard K. Smith. And so we saw the same race to get into space. And all the little kids would go out in the backyard and pretend to be astronauts, and some poor little kid had to be the ground controller and stay home. That was never me, by the way.
Yeah.
But in any case, that was really my first memory. But the first memory of news that really had an effect was the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was a little girl, 7 years old, Birmingham, Alabama. And I remember that it seemed my father and mother, this was something they couldn't protect me from. I kind of knew that. And it was Birmingham. And so they would have the news stories at night with big red arrows coming from Cuba to Birmingham, which was supposed to be the distance that the missiles could go, but of course it really wasn't. But Birmingham wanted to be relevant, so that's what they did. And we had, I just remember thinking that that was very scary. And maybe somewhere deep inside, It sparked my interest in things international. I actually became principally expert on nuclear weapons and military affairs, and so that's really my first real news memory, and being in front of the television for the entire period of the Cuban Missile Crisis every night, waiting to see what the president was going to do.
And years later, when you're working on Cuba policy, did you remember that?
I did, and in fact, something that I said really kind of followed me. I was speaking to a group of Cuban Americans, and I said something that I really believed. I said, Fidel Castro put missiles, Soviet missiles, on Cuban territory to give the Soviet Union the ability to reach the United States, and he should pay for it until he dies. And I absolutely believe that, and Cuba was never going to be a friend of the United States under Fidel Castro, and it's not going to be a friend of the United States under Raul Castro as well.
I actually didn't intend to ask about Cuba, but I think I will, because there's the moves that President Obama made, and then President Trump has sought to sort of pull back some of those. Do you think that's the right policy?
Well, I was never one who believed we were forever going to have an embargo, but I think that in the Bush administration we had a better approach, which was to challenge the Cuban regime, to make progress on release of prisoners, to make progress on letting people have access to technology and to the outside world, and then saying step by step, we will improve US-Cuban relations, because nobody wants permanent enemies. I think to simply open up to Cuba let too much pressure off the regime. And now we have this bizarre situation in which Secretary Tillerson has had to tell Americans not to travel to Cuba because there's some mysterious virus or illness that is going around. So I think you're almost always better to challenge a regime like that to do something differently and to make it a quid pro quo for recognition, because people underestimate the power of recognition from the United States of America. Mm-hmm. When the United States of America says, we recognize your government, we recognize your people, it makes a difference. And so that's not something that should ever be sold short.
So your book is on democracy. It is filled with anecdotes in particular. And for those in the audience that might not be familiar, you've said that you grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. And then, of course, there was the civil rights movement. And then you went to Denver, my hometown.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about your childhood and that decision by your parents to leave. You've also written a book about your parents.
My parents, yes. Well, I was born in Birmingham, Alabama. I was born in 1954. I'm 62, don't start counting. And as a young girl, a young child, you were vaguely aware that it was second-class citizenship for black people. This was the height of Jim Crow. Couldn't go to a restaurant, couldn't go to a movie theater, didn't have a white classmate until we moved to Denver. But I grew up in this lovely little cocoon, really, a little middle-class neighborhood. I think everybody on my block was a school teacher.
Okay.
And it was all about faith and church. That was the principal activity, and then education and family. And so it was protective of its children, and it was almost as if they said, Bull Connor, the police commissioner, is not going to have our kids. And so we were taught that we could do anything we wanted to do, even if we couldn't have a hamburger at Woolworth's lunch counter. We were taught that there are no victims, because the minute you consider yourself a victim, you have given control of your life to somebody else. And we were told, you're going to have to be twice as good. Now, this wasn't said as a matter of debate. This was said as a matter of fact. And so I went around with my friends trying to be twice as good. I now tell my students, if you work hard enough to think you're twice as good, you're going to be very confident. And I think that's what my parents were saying. But in reference to Birmingham and the book, I also think that that was the setting in which I learned the true meaning of democracy and democratic transitions. So I relate in the book being with my Uncle Alto, my mother's brother. He'd picked me up from school, and it was election day in Alabama, and George Wallace was on the ballot. Now, I knew in my own little 6-year-old way that this man, George Wallace, wasn't good for black people. So we passed a long, long line of black people voting. And I said to my uncle, I said, so if all those people vote, this man Wallace can't win. And my uncle said, oh no, he said, we're a minority, he said, and so Wallace is gonna win. And I said to my uncle, so why do they bother? And my uncle said, because they know that one day that vote will matter. Mm. Now, as I looked around the world and I saw Iraqis standing in line to vote, or Afghans, even though there were terrorist threats against them, or Liberians or South Africans, people voting really meaningfully for the first time, they know that one day that vote will matter. Not immediately, but one day that vote will matter, and it's such an empowering moment for people. And so I think I always carried that moment in my head as I watched people struggling to be free around the world.
You write that the civil rights movement was really the Great Awakening.
Yes.
Are we still waking up?
We're still waking up. The civil rights movement, I think, was a second democratic transition. So if you read the tremendous words of the Declaration of Independence and of the Constitution about equality, obviously America was born with a birth defect, which was slavery. And it took us 100 years, more than 100 years, and then it took another 100 years to begin to give rights to the descendants of slaves. But the remarkable thing is that these descendants of slaves trusted the American Constitution enough that they honestly believed they were going to earn their rights through the very Constitution that at once counted them as 3/5 of a man in the first compromise. So the NAACP would actually sit and Thurgood Marshall and others, they had something called the Margot Report, and every Friday morning they would choose cases to take to various courts around the country to try to challenge on constitutional grounds various aspects of discrimination. They'd win some, they'd lose some. But think about that, to channel that through institutions. We tend to think of the civil rights movement as having been all about the marches in Birmingham, yes. About the bus boycott in Selma, yes. But it was also this really unbelievable, unfathomable trust in American institutions that somehow they were going to live up to their obligations and to what they said they were. Now, today, we're still fighting a lot of these struggles because it isn't easy to overcome that kind of prejudice. But when I look at America today, I think how far we've come. I also relate in the book that when President Bush swore me in as Secretary of State, I took a
picture of that.
Yeah, I took an oath to the Constitution that had counted my ancestors as 3/5 of a man. And I took it in front of a portrait of Ben Franklin. Kept thinking, I wonder what old Ben would think of this. and the swearing in was by a Jewish woman justice named Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
And who was with you there?
So that's my Aunt G and my Aunt Mattie, who's now deceased, and my Uncle Elton.
How proud they must have been.
These were my mother's brothers and sisters. Unfortunately, my parents were by this time deceased, but I kind of felt their presence there the entire time. But that's the kind of progress that we've made, and we have to remember that democracies are imperfect at their birth because they're usually a compromise of interest to get to some stable place, and then you just have to keep working at it day after day after day. And so the reason that America is such a beacon for the world is not because it's perfect. It's because it's imperfect and keeps working at its imperfections. And I think when you look around the world, a story like this is empowering for people because they realize even if it took us a long time, we're getting there.
As we look around the world, do you think democracy is in retreat?
Well, this is an academic debate these days. Some of my colleagues at Stanford. Look, democracy is not on the march like we had hoped it would be. We had several events, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the birth of democracies across Eastern Europe. We had the Arab Spring and the hope that the Middle East was really now breaking out. But if you look at where we were, say 35 or 40 years ago, democracy has made tremendous progress. It's not going to be a straight line. And there have been some setbacks in places like Turkey. There have been setbacks. But democracies are still being born. People are still fighting for their rights. Dana, when I taught a course called The Role of the Military in Politics as a young faculty member at Stanford. I could always talk about at least 2 or 3 Latin American juntas in places like Brazil or Chile or Argentina. And today, these are all functioning democracies. And so we have to keep the big picture in mind and realize that even if democracy has stalled in some places, it's still there, it's still making progress, and people are still determined to be free.
You are an expert in Russia. You were expert in the Soviet Union, and you write in the book about watching and the hope and then the almost dismay, I would say now.
Yes.
What do you think about that trajectory?
Well, let me say a couple of things. First of all, it's easy to say this is Vladimir Putin that has taken Russia from hopes about democracy to almost thorough autocracy. But in fact, the Russian story is also one about the failure of institutions. After Gorbachev's reforms, the Soviet Union collapsed. Boris Yeltsin comes to power. They have these kind of nascent democratic institutions, a parliament that's supposed to work, civil society, a relatively free press, hundreds of newspapers and TV stations. And Boris Yeltsin, who did a lot for the country, gets impatient with these institutions. So he starts ruling by decree. And pretty soon, it's a really strong presidency. Now, a strong presidency in the hands of Boris Yeltsin is one thing. A strong presidency in the hands of Vladimir Putin is quite another. One thing the American founding fathers understood is that institutions have to be there not to constrain good people, but to constrain bad people. They have to be equally good at empowering good people and constraining bad people. And unfortunately, the Russian presidency is just too strong. Now, there's still signs of life. You may not have read the other day, Vladimir Putin lost 11 out of 12 in provincial elections. The only district he didn't win in the stolen election of 2016 was Moscow. Russians are different today than they were when I studied in the Soviet Union. When I studied in the Soviet Union, they looked at their feet when they wouldn't invite you to their homes. Now they travel. I have them in my graduate school of business classes. They're undergraduates traveling. And one day, they are going to demand a different Russia.
And one day their vote will matter.
And one day their vote will matter again.
Yeah. Could you tell my favorite story about when the president sent you to deliver a tough message? I don't even know what the message was. You probably still can't tell us.
It was about Georgia. It was about Georgia. Yeah.
And what happened there? This is the best.
So it's 2007, and things are starting to go a little sideways with the Russians and Georgians. The Russians have put embargoes on Georgian products, and I go to see Putin. The president says, you got to go tell Vladimir that if something happens to Georgia, U.S.-Russian relations are going to be really rocky. So I arrive, and usually Putin would receive me right away. I'd land at 4 o'clock. By 5 o'clock, I was at the Kremlin. This day, they kept saying, he's not ready, he's not ready, he's not ready. Finally, 7:30 comes. We drive past the Kremlin. We drive past where his dacha is. And we drive out to this moose lodge out in the middle of nowhere. And
are you worried?
yeah, I'm thinking, where am I going here? And the Russians are having a birthday party for Igor Ivanov, the national security advisor, and Dmitry Medvedev, who was deputy prime minister. And they are all in this big room with, I'm not kidding when I say, various heads of various animals on the wall. And he says, Condi, he says, you would have given anything to be in a room like this when you were a young Soviet specialist. This is the National Security Council of Russia. And I thought, manipulative, right? Manipulative. So I stayed for the birthday party for a little while, and then I said, President Bush has sent me with a message, we need to talk. So we go back into another room, and it's Sergei Lavrov and Putin on one sofa, and Bill Burns, our ambassador, and me on the other sofa, and I'm delivering the message, and all of a sudden Putin stands up. And now he's sort of peering over me, and it was pure instinct. I stood up too. Now, Vladimir Putin is maybe 5'7". In hills, I'm more like 5'10". And so, we kind of backed off and we got back. But that's who he is. He's turned from somebody, and I think President Bush would agree with this. When we first met him, he was almost shy. He wasn't very confident. He went from sort of shy to confident to arrogant to megalomaniacal. And now he is a megalomaniac because not many leaders of great countries ride horses bare-chested.
No.
So
thank God.
Thank God. Yeah. Don't want to give any ideas, but he's really turned into a real problem.
Just one more question on Russia. Why would he, Putin, Russia, want to even try to interfere in our elections? What is the end game? What do they hope to achieve? One expert told me they just want chaos. Is that accurate?
I think that this was, you interfered in my election, and so I'm going to mess around in yours and show you that your democracy's not so perfect either. He's an eye for an eye kind of guy.
Okay.
And I suspect that he wanted to create chaos, that these bots that they're using for fake news and the like, you know, they may have wanted to influence opinion, but I really think it was more about sowing chaos. And unfortunately, I believe our reaction has been a bit satisfying to him. I fully believe we need to investigate what happened and let the chips fall where they may. We certainly need to figure out how not to have systems that are so vulnerable. I think we're starting to learn that social media is vulnerable in ways that we didn't understand. You know, people aren't good with their email. People who, you know, key in phishing emails. So we have a lot of work to do on our own. But I probably would have said, you know, we know you did it. But we have absolute confidence in our institutions and in our elections. And so don't do it again, because by playing to this sense that we are spinning, our heads are spinning off, I think it's actually, it must be very satisfying to him.
Interesting. I want to maybe turn to the Middle East and sort of a bigger picture. You do have there's ISIS, there's the recent referendum that the Kurds had in Iraq. But I wanted you to start with Saudi Arabia. And the reason is because as I was preparing for this, I was remembering, I keep this in mind a lot. I was going to say Secretary Rice, but Condi gave a speech in Cairo in the last year of the Bush presidency.
Early, yeah.
And I remember her saying to this group, mostly of men, that you will never succeed economically, you will never grow if you keep 50% of your population under wraps. And now you see that women, I guess in 18 months, they're going to get to drive. They have to ease their way into this.
It's a little while. Well, the thing about the Middle East is we tend to think of all of the Middle Eastern countries as identical when it comes to questions like how repressive is the regime, what does it look like for women, how much does the regime reach out to the outside world, and they're very different. And Saudi Arabia has been by far the most conservative. It's a conservative society. It is the keeper of the two great mosques and so forth. But one of the most interesting paradoxes was that King Abdullah was in many ways a very progressive man in his own conservative way. I remember being there with President Bush, and we'd have these conversations, and then I would go on my own, and he would start talking about these universities that he was building. He built a great university, $10 billion endowment. And he was so proud because women and men were going to study together, and they were going to study the sciences and technical subjects. Because he said, basically, our boys and girls spend too much, our boys in particular, spend too much time studying religion, not studying things that are practical, he said. Now, that's pretty amazing from the king of Saudi Arabia. The other thing that they did was that he told me in 15 women are going to vote. Now, the vote in Saudi Arabia isn't exactly, you know, the vote in the United States, but it, as such as it was, advisory in its capacity, women would vote. Indeed, they do. They run for office now. And he said, eventually they will drive. He said, but, you know, many of them don't want to because it's dangerous. And I just sort of let that go, you know. But they are making, and now they've got a very young monarch, the deputy crown prince, who is trying to push the frontiers. He recognizes that Saudi Arabia can't be dependent on oil forever. It's got to diversify its economy, and so he's pushing. But to me, the most interesting thing about Saudi Arabia was to think that you were going to educate women. Over half of the grads from college in Saudi Arabia are women. That you would think you were going to educate women and they were going to stay behind burqas and not drive and not work. It wasn't going to happen. And so the interesting question will be, how do they make this transition? How smooth is it? How long does it take? But there's still a lot to do in Saudi Arabia. There's still too many very, very reactionary clerics who are preaching to young boys. There's still too many terrorists being funded. There's still too many freedom fighters who are being lashed or put in jail. But there are some small signs of progress.
I remember being in Kuwait with the president. I don't know if you'll remember this. We had a little bit of time, and he could go see a Little League game, or he could go visit some women who all ran for office for the very first time. And when you came in, they were very shy, and they said, the president walked in and he said, "I am so proud of you." And they said, "But Mr. President, we all lost our first race." And he said, "So did I." Which is great. So there's Kuwait, and somebody in the audience here, and I'm sorry I don't have the name, wanted to ask about your opinion about the Kurds referendum, and should it be respected?
Well, it's a very difficult situation because the Kurds have been such good friends of the United States, and we've been good friends of the Kurds. And in their own way, they have managed their affairs better than most of Iraq. There's a fair amount of corruption in Kurdistan, but they have fought valiantly against ISIS, and they have taken a lot of land in the process. And so do you really ask them then to go back to just being a part of an Iraq which they never really felt completely a part of? Now, the geostrategic answer is they have to stay in Iraq, because there are also Kurds in Turkey and Kurds in Syria, and if you start independent Kurdistan, you're going to destroy what is left of the map of the Middle East. So that's the geostrategic point. Secondly, I believe the Kurds will be safer and stronger in a highly confederalized or decentralized Iraq than they will be on their own. And so the issue is to find a way, a structure for Iraq that gives them maximum autonomy, probably considerable control over their oil resources, lets their culture continue to thrive, but doesn't break up Iraq as de facto or de jure, even if de facto it's operating as very separate pieces. The other problem is the minute you start a Kurdistan, and then what happens to the Sunnis and what happens to the Shia, do they lean toward Iran? So we have to try to keep Iraq together. And this is where the United States of America can't be absent. President Bush was on the video conference with Maliki weekly. Mm-hmm. I was in Iraq 11 times. When people are on their first steps in these very, very difficult situations, it's hand-to-hand combat to get in there and help them to settle their differences and the like. And so I've been a little disturbed that we don't seem to be on the front lines right now in helping the Iraqis find an answer to the Kurdish referendum.
What do you think of the current state of Middle East peace being in particular as it regards Israel?
Well, right now we're nowhere in terms of Middle East peace. The Palestinians should have taken the deal that Ehud Olmert wanted to give them in November of 2008. Yeah, we were just about out of office. As a matter of fact, I said to Abbas at the time, I said, what you should do is you should bring the deal, deposit it with the President of the United States. The President of the United States will pass it to his successor, and you can start there. Didn't do it. And they started from scratch, and it's never been as close. I've come to believe that, well, yes, there are blocks on the Israeli side. The major blocks are on the Palestinian side. The Palestinians need to work on better governance. They had a very good prime minister in Salam Fayyad. Mm-hmm. They were making some progress in rooting out corruption, having a budget online so people could see where the money was being spent. Economy was growing. But until the Palestinians take hold of their own future, Salam Fayyad once said, I'm going to build my state even if I have to build it under occupation. And right now, the attitude is much less that way, and I fear that the careful work that we did to build a Palestinian partner for the Israelis, that is slipping. But there will be another opportunity, and hopefully people will get it right, because there really is only one answer, and that's a two-state solution.
And looming over all of this is Iran and its pursuit of a nuclear weapon. There's a deal that was made in the Obama administration. President Trump it was said today in the press briefing that he will make an announcement this week, and all intentions are that he's going to decertify the deal.
Yeah, it's not a deal I would have signed. If I had brought it to President Bush, I think he would have thought I kind of lost my mind, and because it's not a terribly good deal. But it is what it is. And if the Iranians are living up to the letter, if not the spirit of the law, then the United States needs to be a country that is seen to keep its obligations. Secondly, our allies have a lot wrapped up in it. So I think what you could do, and maybe they'll do this, is decertify but not immediately put back the sanctions that were taken off. Give some time to improve some aspects of the deal, like the ability to do challenge inspections instead of having to wait 24 days until you can visit a site and people can clean it up. You do have to address the fact that the Iranians are the major troublemakers in the Middle East, whether it's in Yemen or Syria, or even the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia or Bahrain. And so there's a lot to do, but I think it's smarter not to just blow up the deal. It's smarter to try to work towards something to replace it. You know, we had a similar situation when we came into office in 2001. What was then called the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty had been signed with the Soviet Union at a time when we had tens of thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at each other, and people believed defenses, if you could defend yourself, that was destabilizing, because what would I do? I would fire first, defend myself, and then I would get away with it. So ballistic missile defenses, missile defense was basically prohibited by the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. We came into office, we said, you know, things have changed. First of all, nobody really worries about exchange of nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia. Missile defenses are now the key to dealing with the North Koreans and the Iranians. And so we tried to negotiate with the Russians to get out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, but we gave a year's notice. We took the clause that said you could withdraw. We did it in an orderly fashion. And as a matter of fact, by doing it in an orderly fashion, we even signed a landmark agreement with the Russians a couple of years later, further limiting nuclear arms. Right. So these things can be done, but they have to be done in a very careful and diplomatic way.
Can they be done in North Korea?
North Korea is quite a different matter. We tried hard. You know, we tried hard with the North Koreans to get a deal. We came close. We had to walk out because ultimately they wouldn't do what we needed them to do. But that was with his father, Kim Jong-il. And Kim Jong-il lived in a parallel universe, but it was a bounded parallel universe. I'm not so sure about Kim Jong-un. And one thing that worries me about it is people keep saying, well, you know, he just wants his regime to survive, and so you could meet his interests. I'm not sure he seems very isolated to me, very reckless. He's somebody who reached into Malaysia and killed his half-brother with VX gas when his half-brother was under Chinese protection. Who do you think that was a message to? That was a message to the Chinese. And so the Chinese may not even have as much authority as we think with the North Koreans. So this is a very dangerous situation. I think the administration is doing about the best you can do under these circumstances. Although I do think, as I said on your show earlier, you know, Washington has a tendency to let rhetoric get out ahead. Let's calm down the rhetoric a little bit.
And what about the either perceived or real daylight between the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, and President Trump? There was I woke up this morning. I had all these things I was going to ask you, and I thought, well, I might not have to talk about Rex Tillerson and Trump. And then this morning, President Trump tweeted, well, he had done an interview with Forbes in which they'd asked him about this question of whether Tillerson had called President Trump a moron. And President Trump said, that's fake news, but you know what, I'll challenge him to an IQ contest. I could see him making that joke.
It's a joke.
Like 98% right. Joke.
Yeah.
2% real. And I remember one time, I don't know if you'll remember this, it was a real moment of empowerment for me and understanding of leadership. Do you remember when there were these Israelis, they were coming over, they wanted to meet with President Bush because they didn't think that you were speaking for him? And we were in the pre-brief, and you were explaining to him what it was, and he said, okay, I got it. And when they came in and they sat down, and President Bush didn't give them 2 minutes to even make their case, he just stopped and said, don't ever doubt that she speaks for me. Right. Did you have anything else to say?
Yeah.
And that was very empowering for you, but if somebody's trying to look like they're undercutting, whether it's your enemy, your ally, your political opponents, or even between the two individuals,
Well, look,
the problem?
this is perhaps, in foreign policy at least, it's the most important relationship in government, in any administration, is the relationship between the Secretary of State and the President. And let me just put aside the Rex Tillerson thing. I'm going to just trust that when the two of them say they have a good relationship, they have a good relationship.
And they had lunch today, apparently.
And they had lunch, they're working at it. I think Rex Tillerson spends a lot of time, he's not somebody who spends a lot of time publicly, but I know that he's working very hard, to isolate the North Koreans, and several governments have been saying that they're actually going to expel North Korean ambassadors and stop trade. So he's just getting up every day and going to work. But the relationship is critical for so many reasons. And when President Bush asked me to be the Secretary of State, I gave him a book to read. It was Dean Acheson's Present at the Creation, because Dean Acheson and his president understood that there could be no daylight between the president and the Secretary of State. And indeed, Dean Acheson once said that if you're not careful, the State Department will tell the President of the United States, or will constantly talk about what the president meant to say, and presidents tend to resent that, he said. All right? So that's all the way back with Dean Acheson and Truman. So the relationship has to be rock solid. The president has to trust the Secretary of State to know the boundaries of what's possible. We talked all the time. As a matter of fact, when I got ready to go over to the State Department, I said to the president, how are we going to stay in touch? Because, I used to be right down the hall. I'd walk to your office 6-7 times a day. He said, well, I might not remember to call you, but you can call me. And I did all the time. And we checked signals all the time. That way, when I was out on the road, I didn't have to phone home.
You knew.
Because the Secretary of State has to be a presence out there really representing the United States, and I knew that I could do that.
Could we talk about a good news story when it comes to democracy, and something that President Bush and you were instrumental in, and that is Liberia, which doesn't get a lot of attention or credit, but it's a really remarkable story. Going back all the way till 2003, when you went to him with an article from the New York Times.
Well, Liberia is a real success story, and it's a success story of American policy, really. So the short story is that in 2003, there was a terrible warlord named Charles Taylor, and he was just ravaging the country, and he was using child soldiers. And there was a picture of one of these boys on the front page of the New York Times. The kid could not have been more than maybe 10 years old, and he had an AK-47 in one hand and a teddy bear backpack in the other. And I took that to President Bush, and I said, we have to do something about this. And he said, what do you think it would take? And I said, oh, some Marines. And he said, I don't think so, but you know what? He asked the Pentagon, what would it take to deal with this warlord, Charles Taylor? And we had the backing of the African Union. We had a very strong partner in John Kufuor, who was the president of Ghana at the time and the head of the West African organization. And the Pentagon came in and said, 2 divisions. I said, 2 divisions to deal with a warlord? I don't think so. They came back eventually. We put 100 Marines at the airport, 100 Marines at the seaport. We did float a large American flotilla out there just so that they would know there was something to back them up. And Charles Taylor left.
Quickly, right? I mean, it didn't take long.
Quickly. As a matter of fact, the African leaders went and got him and put him on a plane. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf became the first woman to be elected president on the African continent. Mrs. Bush and I went to her inauguration. I will never forget, it was hot as Hades. There were potholes that you could lose the car in. It was just a sad, sad country. But she's giving her speech, and she says, and the African leaders are all lined up there, and they're all applauding everything she says. And then she says, and today, I will have my finances and the finances of every one of my cabinet officers posted online. They didn't applaud that. So she was changing things. Now, not only did we intervene, but we then helped them, and they became a Millennium Challenge country. And by the way, I write about the Millennium Challenge in the book because the Millennium Challenge recognized something that we sometimes talk about democracy. It's great to get the institutions right and so forth, but ultimately you got to deliver for the people. And particularly when you're a democratic government, you have to be shown as delivering, not the United States just coming in with large aid packages and the like. And so the Millennium Challenge took countries that were trying to govern democratically, trying to govern wisely, and gave them large financial aid packages to help with issues like titling the land so that you could combine agricultural plants or plots, or building electrical grids so that these leaders could deliver for their people.
We also did something interesting. It was when we were there in Liberia, and she talked about all the kids that weren't going to school.
Yes.
And she explained that they weren't going to school because the parents were sending them out to help get food for the day. And then we used the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, to help provide breakfast and lunch. And that made, she said that then there was like a 98% attendance rate
and now
at the
kids
schools.
could go to school.
Right.
So you have to help. It's not just you let them have an election and then you drop it. Elections are the first step in democracy. They're not even the most important step. I mean, they're the moment when people get to express themselves. But now you've got to build those institutions. Now you've got to build real capability. And so through Millennium Challenge and others, we did that. And I want to say one thing about foreign assistance in this regard. I know there's a lot of debate about foreign assistance, is it wasted and so forth. But one reason the Millennium Challenge was set up this way was we had very strong indicators about whether you were fighting corruption, whether you were empowering women, whether you were doing health care for your people. And I think we were using American taxpayers' dollars wisely. Now, we're having a debate now where it seems people think, if you ask Americans, how much do we spend on foreign assistance? They will say 25% of the budget.
Well, they'll always say too much.
They are too much. But people will honestly say 25% of the budget. It's between 1% and 1.5%, depending on what you count. And it is money worth spending on good governance, because when we talk about democracy, I always think that there's a moral case, right? If we honestly believe that these values are universal, then it can't be true for us and not them. And we're either living a lie about our own values, or we have to care about those values out there. That's the moral case. No man, woman, or child should ever have to live in tyranny, as the president said in his second inaugural. But there's a practical case, too. Democracies don't fight each other. Democracies don't send child soldiers into battle. Democracies don't invade their neighbors. Democracies don't harbor terrorists. And so we have a reason to want to see the number of well-governed democracies grow for our own security and our own well-being. So whatever we can do to empower people who are trying, and you know, I don't particularly like the word democracy promotion. I like the word democracy support, because there are always people in those countries who are looking to have the same freedoms we do, and you need to support them.
We only have about 8 minutes and 22 seconds left. Of course, I have so much I want to ask you about. I will say that there's several questions that came in from the audience. I know the answer to this, so we can keep this one short. Will you ever run for office?
No, thank you very much.
I remember you talked about, where was it that I read that you talked about, maybe it was in your other book, about how you saw President Bush on the campaign trail, and it gave him energy, and it drained you.
Drained me. He was raring to go after 5, 6, 7 events. I just wanted to go to the hotel. You know, so.
Here's a question I would like to ask. So we've talked about a lot of places around the world. We're all pretty engaged people following things in the world. What are we missing? Like, what concerns you, or what are you hopeful about that we aren't necessarily seeing on the front page of the papers, or even if you dig a little deeper?
Well, let me give you 2 and then bring it back to America, because I'm mostly worried that America will abdicate its responsibility to make sure that our world is peaceful, prosperous, and free. If America is committed, we'll get through all of these crises. But right now, we have the re-emergence of what I call in the book the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: populism, nativism, isolationism, and protectionism. And they tend to ride together. And they're not just riding in the United States. They're riding in places like Germany, where 13.5% for the Alternative for Germany, a hard right populist movement that I don't think anybody ever thought would win enough seats to be in the parliament in Germany. And even in places where they're not winning elections, they are changing the conversation. So nobody wants to stand up for immigrants. Nobody wants to stand up for free trade. And we did this once after World War I. And the people who created the system after World War II said, not again. This time the international economy is going to be a growing economy so that it's not a fixed pie, so that it's not a zero-sum game. We're going to have free trade, and with free trade, everybody's going to be more prosperous. And it succeeded brilliantly. And they believed in free peoples, that free peoples wouldn't fight each other. So they built a free Germany and a free Japan. And that's paid off. Who would have thought Germany and Japan would never fight again? And it was all protected by American military power, this time permanently. And Article 5, an attack upon one is an attack upon all. A defense treaty with Japan, with South Korea, willingness to defend the sea lanes. And I know that it's been burdensome, and I know that Americans are sometimes tired. I was in the Oval with President Bush in August of 2008, and in case you didn't know, the polls weren't so great for the Bush administration in August of 2008. And he said, I don't believe these polls. He said, you know, we couldn't be. I said, Mr. President, they're tired of us, all right? I said, it's been vigilance and war and terrorism, they're tired of us. But you know, great powers can't get tired. Because when great powers get tired, it isn't Germany that steps up, or Brazil, or India. No, it's Vladimir Putin, and it's the Iranians, and it's ISIS, which finally I think we're close to defeating. So that vacuum is what I fear most. It's not a specific crisis here or there, but it's the vacuum that's born of this sense that we are too lacking confidence, too weak, too small, not compassionate enough to care about them out there. We'll lose if that becomes America.
I have so many stories that I love to tell about times with President Bush. You want to pick one of your favorites, and we'll end on that? It could be funny, it could be meaningful, moving.
Okay, I'll give you two.
Okay.
One funny and one meaningful. I'll start with meaningful. When we were in the Oval Office trying to decide, or he was trying to decide whether or not to launch PEPFAR, there was one final meeting. And it was me as National Security Advisor, Josh Bolton, who was OMB at the time, and Mike Gerson, and a few other people. And when we first came into office in 2001, it had been the case that people were saying antiretrovirals couldn't cure, and so was it worth doing? And the NIH and Tony Fauci and others started to talk about the fact that you might not be able to cure, but you could extend life. And the president went around and he asked each person, then should we do this? And I related to him that my mother had first had cancer when I was 15, and she lived another 15 years, and how much it meant that I had my mother when I grew up, and she could see her daughter become a professor at Stanford and so forth.
Especially after where you started.
Where we started, and so she could see that.
So you were better than the others.
I guess so. So we were able to do that. And then the president went around and he asked everybody. And then he just said, because, you know, the budget people had their, well, you know, this and that and budget. And he said, you know, from those to whom a lot is given, much is expected, quoting from Matthew. And that was a moment of presidential leadership that wasn't just presidential, it was America at its best, America at its most compassionate, America at recognizing that it could do things that others couldn't. And I've never been more proud.
And it succeeded.
And it succeeded. And if you haven't had a chance to look at the results we're getting with PEPFAR, and Ambassador Birx is here, who's been a tremendous supporter and guardian of that program through multiple administrations now. You need to see what it's done. I remember going to Uganda and hearing a child's choir, a choir of orphans, AIDS orphans, sing God Bless America. Mm-hmm. And so that's it. Now, the funny one.
Okay.
So even in difficult times, funny things happen. So we invaded Afghanistan in October, first week in October. The Asia-Pacific Economic Council was supposed to meet in Shanghai on Friday, September the 13th. on Friday, September the 14th. And so obviously, we didn't go because of September 11th. This is 2001. But the president said, we're going to make that trip. And so we were in Shanghai that first week after we'd invaded Afghanistan. And so every morning, we would have a video conference with the president, me, and Andy Card in China, kind of like this, trying to make sure the Chinese couldn't hear. And then we would have Vice President Cheney and Steve Hadley, my deputy, on the other side. So it's 12-hour time difference. So this particular day, we're getting up in the morning. It's nighttime there, and Vice President comes on, and he looks just gray. You can see it through them. And as only the Vice President could do, he intones, Mr. President, the White House detectors have detected botulinum toxin. There is no known cure, no known antidote, and we're all going to die. And the president said, Dick, what was that again? And he said, well, there's no known antidote, and those of us who were exposed are going to die. So Colin says, what's the exposure time? Hoping he wasn't in the White House. But of course, it turns out he was, and so we all sort of sink back in our chairs. And so the president says, go call Hadley and find out what's going on. So I call Steve Hadley. Steve is has this Midwestern sense of humor. Steve says, well, yes, we've sent the samples to the CDC. He said, and it's entirely possible that it's, that it's a false report, a false alarm. He said, let me put it this way. If the mice are feet down, we're fine. If the mice are feet up, we're toast. So we're in China. We're having lunch with the Chinese 24 hours later, and I get a note that Steve Hadley is on the phone. So I go and I pass by the president's table, and I say, Steve Hadley's on the phone. So I go to Steve, get on the phone. Steve says, good news, the mice are feet down. It was a false alarm. So I go back by the president's table, and I say, Mr. President, good news, the mice are feet down. He says, thank goodness, the mice are feet down. At this point, they translate for the Chinese. And I'm sure the Chinese are thinking, what code are these people? But even in tough times, there are lighthearted moments that you can remember.
Well, the mice surely are feet down. Thank you so much. Everybody, let's give a round of applause to Condoleezza Rice.
Thank you, Dr. Rice and Dana, for being here. That's absolutely inspirational. Thank you, President Bush and Mrs. Bush, for surrounding yourself with such awesome people that we get to host here. You are an inspiration to the work we do here at the Bush Center and here in the community to work day by day on issues like free trade, on issues like responsible immigration and democracy. We're going to take this show on the road to New York to our Spirit of Liberty conference next Thursday, where we're going to be reaffirming why democracy is so important to the United States and our leadership means something to the rest of the world. So thank you for setting such a great example. Both of these great authors have their books outside on your way out that you can find. Also, if you haven't had a chance, the Portraits of Courage exhibit, President Bush's inspirational paintings of our veterans, will be here through October 17th. And next weekend, we'll be honored to host, as a celebration of the last weekend, some veterans who are the subjects of those paintings who will be here to sign books and to tell their stories. You can check our website. Our Engage event on November 5th with the other two new authors, Barbara and Jenna, and their new book. That, unfortunately, is sold out, but if you don't have tickets, you can live stream it through the Bush Center Facebook page. And a thank you to all the members who are here, and for those who aren't members, it's great to be a member because you get first notice of all these great events. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I look forward to welcoming you at the next event.